Hello, everyone. Welcome to the briefings for the Glasgow Summer Cup 2024. So let me introduce the CA team so that you can actually put a face behind the names that you'll see on Discord, sending you the clarifications and, the motions. So on the CA team, you have Daniela, myself, and Erasmus. And if you have any questions about the motions, we're going to be the ones who are going to be answering them. So let's just start with the speaker briefings. There's going to be a separate video for the judge briefings. Let's start with the speaker briefings. What I'm going to discuss is firstly just some of the basic rules of the BP format, so we can make sure that everyone is aware of how it works and the role filter that you have. There's going to be still some stuff about online tournaments and specifically the rules you want to apply there or specifically in this tournament. So do also keep note if you already are aware of how PP works. Then I'm going to go shortly over the motion types that we have. And then I'm going to do this a bit shortly so you can pause the video if you want to read the slides, which contain a bit more info. So to keep the video not too long. And lastly, I'll also talk about POIs. This is important not only because engagement is important, but also because we will be implementing a new rule in which we're going to more harshly punish people for not taking POIs. And you need to know what that rule is, so then please stick to the video and actually engage with it. So let's start with the tournament format. The competition uses the British Parliament format, or the BP format, in which there are going to be 4 teams. The 4 teams are spread out over 2 benches. The first bench is the government bench, also called the proposition bench, because it just is in favor of the motion. Then you have 2 teams here. You have opening government and you have closing government. You also have an opposition bench, which doesn't have an alternative name. There, the first team is called the opening opposition, and the second team is called the closing opposition. And the idea is that if you are part of one specific team, then you're going to try to beat all the other teams as well. So it is definitely possible for you as opening opposition to take a first, whereas someone in closing opposition takes a fourth, even though you are in the same bench. Now, let's talk about the formalities. You have 15 minutes to prepare for a motion. This is called prep time. This happens after the motion has been released, which will be on Discord, and it will be a countdown when the motion will be released. It is important to note that you cannot use the internet to look up information during preparation time. What you can do is maybe use a translation machine if you have difficulty finding the right words in English, but you shouldn't use Wikipedia, you shouldn't use AI to make arguments. This is just something that you and your partner should try to come up with arguments. The speeches are going to be 7 minutes long. After 7 minutes, you're going to have a 15-second grace period in which you can finish your sentence, where you can, finish up your speech. But after 7 minutes 15, the judges will stop writing things down. And this is important. You should join the right Zoom room before the end of prep time. We want to make sure the debate, is on time, and also the tournament doesn't have too many delays. So please, please, please enter your breakout room on time, which is before the end of prep time, so debates can start on time, and any possible issues that could pop up with joining are resolved quickly compared to maybe everyone having the same problems at the same times and just, us getting delayed unnecessarily. What is then the role that you have as a different team? Okay, I'm going to keep this a bit short. If you want to read the sentences, you can just pause the video. So let's just start with opening government. Opening government, you need to explain the motion. What do the words mean? How do you think the motion might be implemented, or what the world would look like? Explain why that is the case. And also, lastly, you just need to advance arguments that are in favor of the motion. Why is it good? Or why is the other side bad? Then, as opening opposition, you have the burden to do the opposite. So you need to say if the motion has been defined unfairly, that it has been defined unfairly, or that you disagree with it, why you disagree, how this affects the debate, and then also just say reasons or give reasons and give argumentation why the opposite of the motion is true, and why your world is better. As closing teams, you should just bring a new argument or new case or new explanation, new impact, new rebuttal, anything that is new and it hasn't been brought in opening half. So if opening government is going to give reasons and you just copy those reasons, we cannot credit those reasons. It needs to be something new. And also, just because it's something new doesn't mean that it is winning. You need to explain why is it more true, why is it more important than anything your opening half has already talked about. Also, this is important, there shouldn't be tension between the bench. Or what does it mean? It just means that if opening government explains that you're going to give the right to vote to everyone, then you can't, as closing government, say, we're going to do that except for these small regions, right? So you need to agree with overall the policies your opening government brings, or kind of argumentation likes to bring. It is possible for you to outframe your opening. That's to say, you can say, opening government talks about these kinds of cases. We talk about other kinds of cases. Both are possible to happen in the world, are more likely for these reasons, and also they are more important for these reasons. What you cannot do, you cannot rebut your opening government. So you cannot say they gave this reason. This reason is wrong because of these and these reasons. What you can say is the number of times that they are correct, or their framing is correct, or the number of cases they're talking about is smaller than our side because we just bring stronger analysis and explaining how people engage with the state, for example. That is possible, but you shouldn't outright rebut your opening. Okay, now this is how it comes to role fulfillment. Now let's just start with info slides, because we're going to give info slides at this tournament. It just contains information that clarifies the debate or just explains the context, and you should just, accept them as true. If there's extra information that you want to give, you can give that, but you need to explain why it is true and why it's important for the debate. In the info slide, you can't challenge what's in the info slide. That's just what will happen. The clarifications should only be asked in the motion clarification channel. There are other channels that are going to be on the Discord. Don't get caught up in those. At the moment you want to ask a motion clarification, only use that channel. If you're going to ask for a clarification, you should ask yourself, can I debate the motion without this knowledge? Is it essential to create a clear debate for me to, have an answer to this question? Or is this just maybe a fair characterization that I can explain in debate by myself? And if, you've asked these questions, then and you feel like it's still important, then you should ask the clarifications. But if this is just how does this look like? How will this be implemented? That kind of stuff. Most of the time, the answer will be, that is something that you should characterize by yourself. This is something that maybe you should already have known. We cannot give you more information than the motion already gives you and the info slide already gives you. So, treat carefully. Lastly, we want to make sure that people have the capacity to actually read the clarifications and that they have the time to still make arguments. So we're only going to answer questions, or we're going to try to only answer the questions within the first 5 minutes of prep time. So after that, we're going to not, accept any more clarifications, because again, some teams might not be able to check all these clarifications and therefore are unable to actually engage with the clarification that we've given. Similarly to the info slide, just presume that the clarifications that we're giving are true and correct. If you debate against them, that's just not true. That's like debating that the sky is green. It's not true for debate, so it doesn't matter. It's not functional. So now let's start with policy motions. Policy motions are motions like this house would, or this house believes that X should Y. So as an example here, this house would allow any region to get independence by a referendum. What is then, the basics of the motion? So the context of this debate is just any country where this reasonably can take place. So when you have, for example, an independence by referendum, most likely this is not going to happen in dictatorships. Seems very unlikely, but this will happen in most likely in democracies, and maybe not even fully functioning or like fully uncorrupt like democracies. So this can take place there. And you as opening government have fiat, or you can bring a model. So you can say how this be implemented. So you can say it needs to pass 50% or 60% threshold, and then you can get independence. And you just have fiat. What does this mean? It just means it will get passed through government. So opposition can make the argument, but the government would never allow this to happen because the government right now is right-wing and they don't like this plan, or that kind of stuff. What they can do is still run backlash arguments. So they can say people on the ground don't like it, and therefore it might be hard to implement for these and these reasons. So they can talk about, the backlash and maybe how it's hard to implement, but not that the government will not push the plan through. Opening opposition, if this is a policy motion, has the possibility to bring a mutually exclusive model that kind of requires the same amount of effort or money. So just ask yourself, for example, in the first motion, you could say, we're going to have this decided by a Supreme Court, for example. Then clearly you can't have someone like a group vote on it and overturn like the court or that kind of stuff, because otherwise it would just, be the other plan anyway. And also it just takes a bit of like time and money to implement this, or just like rule changes. And you can just say all of these things will also happen. So it is something that is related to the motion, it is mutually exclusive, and is talking about the same thing. So you cannot talk about something that is superfluous or just like not relevant for the motion and just say that's what we're going to do, because that's not what the debate is about, because either side can do it. It's not mutually exclusive to, I don't know, give money to homeless people. Now, what are then the burdens in this debate? So you just need to explain why something is good or bad. And that is just basically what you need to do. Just explain why it is better on your side or worse on the other side. It's not that deep. It's important to note that this is not an active motion. So when you have, for example, this House believe that Scotland should form an independent union with Northern Ireland, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't just matter whether it is good for Scotland or for Northern Ireland. You can also make arguments on why this is bad for England, and then you can win with that by explaining that. So it's not just about the specific actors that are within the motion. It's just for the average informed voter who's not from a specific country or place, what would they care about? And then you just explain it to them why they should care for these kinds of things. Okay, now that's done with policy motions. Let's now talk about analysis motions. So you have motions like this House believes in the interest of Scotland to form an independent union with Northern Ireland, or this House supports movements seeking independence to focus on historical ties of groups to their lands. So again, the basics here is this just takes place in any country where it reasonably can take place. So movements seeking independence might also actually happen in dictatorships. That doesn't necessarily only happen in democracies. So you can also talk about, those kinds of contexts, because that is where these movements are, where they try to seek independence. The important thing is, which distinguishes this from a policy motion, you do not have fiat. So you just need to explain why it is likely for something to happen. So you need to explain on the government side, for example, how is it that most likely these movements are going to talk about historical ties? You can just say, this is how we're going to talk about this. Then the burden that you then just have is explaining why the world would look in a specific way, and then why something is good or bad. And this also just a general point, which applies for all motions, is they don't need to be just practical concerns. This can also be a principal concern. Maybe, one of these motions leads to people being mean to their grandparents, and you think that's principally wrong, and you explain why it's principally wrong. That can win the debate. It's not just about practical stuff. The same applies also for policy motions, obviously. And again, this is important. You should know this is not an active motion. It's not about one specific actor and what is in their interest. It's just for, for the average voter, which is not from a specific place, what would they care about? Now, there are more types of analysis motions, and one is called, is much more comparative. It's this House prefers a world in which Scotland remains independent, and this House regrets the formation of the EU. So I'm saying comparative because it is a historical motion. So it just, you as the government side need to now have to defend and explain how the world would look like if the motion happened, right? So if the motion was always true. So Scotland would have always been independent during like the medieval times and that kind of stuff. And here there's also just a reasonability caveat, in sense, most likely Scotland would not be independent during the Stone Age, because then we didn't really have nations. So, when there were countries, or when Scotland began to exist, that is when it remained independent. And again, you just don't have any fiat. You just need to explain how would this world have looked like? Why would it have looked like that way? And then you need to explain why the world looking that way is overall good or overall bad. Yeah. And then what we also have is this House prefers motions, which are this House prefers X to Y, this House prefers people to be welcoming to strangers over being skeptical to strangers. So it just gives you a clear comparative. It asks you compare world X with world Y, or context X with context Y, and then you just need to explain why one, being welcoming, is better than the other one, being skeptical. If the motion does not give you a comparative, it is just this House prefers people to be welcoming to strangers, then this is something that, then the opposition side needs to defend the status quo. So the status quo, sometimes we're welcoming, sometimes we're skeptical. Then you need to do analysis. When are we welcoming? When are we skeptical? And then you need to compare that world to the alternative world on government side, which would be just be welcoming to strangers. Again, you don't have any fiat. You need to explain why the world looks this way, and then also why this is important, why this leads to bad or good outcomes, and why these things matters. Okay, now let's talk with a more funky type of analysis motion. This House hopes. So this House hopes is a future-looking motion, and an example would be this House hopes Scotland will gain independence within the next 20 years. So in the future, something will happen, And the motion will give you a time frame. So here it is just clearly 20 years. And then you just need to explain why that thing will be good or bad. There's something funky happening here with preconditions. So you should ask yourself, what would need to happen for the motion to happen? And what can happen without necessarily the motion happening? And these preconditions, or these things that would need to happen, but would not necessarily lead to the motion, those also apply to the opposition side. This might be a bit abstract, so I'm going to give you an example. You can explain why on the government side, the Scottish National Party, the SNP, needs to be in power for you to get independence within the next 20 years, because they're maybe the only party who's actively pushing for it, or it's like a big milestone and this kind of stuff. But it's also possible for the SNP to be in power without getting independence or without trying to get independence. So again, like the SNP is in power, was in power for a couple of years and has been trying to get independence. So you could say the SNP is a needed condition, but it will not necessarily lead to independence. So on the upside, you still have to defend that the SNP will be in power. So making arguments why, if this is the case, the SNP will be in power and that is bad, doesn't make sense, because you would also need to defend the SNP being in power. So again, just like any analysis motion, you do not have any fiat in explaining how the future will look like. You just have to explain why will it look like this way? Why is this a precondition? And then explain why then the consequences of that is overall good or bad. Now, the last analysis motion is a this house predicts motion. So you have, for example, this house predicts that Northern Ireland and Ireland will unify within the next 50 years. This is future looking, and it's just asking something will happen or not. Explain to me and make it likely that it will happen or not. You do not need to explain why this is good or bad. It doesn't matter whether it's good for Northern Ireland and Ireland to form a union. It is just asking you, make it likely for me that I believe that indeed it will unify or it will not unify. So any claims about morality or something being good or bad are irrelevant. It's just about, will this happen or not? Lastly, let's talk about POIs. So I want to make these rules clear because there have been different norms at different tournaments, and we're just using mostly the EUDC manual, except for the new rule change that we're going to implement. So you have protected time. That is the first and last minute. So from 6 to 7 and from 0 to 1. And there, in those times, someone cannot offer POIs. So it's a protected time. What you can do is you can ask POIs in the time between. And this can be done via chat, which is the preferred way, or this can be done via video or audio. This should have, however, only happen if the speaker asks you or asks people to do this before the start of the speech. Because unlike in-person debates, you can't really expect someone to suddenly start speaking, and therefore it can be very disorienting, especially because you're also maybe debating in a specific context where you maybe don't really have papers on hand, or you're not really prepared for the POI. So just, if people don't say the preference, use the chat, and then if they do say video or audio, then use video or audio. If you have a POI, you have a maximum of 15 seconds to be able to ask that POI. However, if a speaker cuts you off at any time, you need to stop talking. Even if you haven't finished your sentence, even if you feel like it's unfair, even if you feel like you want to say more, the speaker has cut you off. They are the shepherd of their speech. They're able to cut you off, and therefore you should stop talking. There's a clear caveat here, right? At the moment, you've been cut off before you can reasonably finish a point, or where it just feels like you can't reasonably engage with it, then the POI is not counted as engagement. And therefore, the speaker will still get punished. So speakers should be reasonable and not cut off people too quickly, but they do have the right to actually cut you off. And then the judge will take into consideration if you have had enough time or not. The recommendation that the manual gives is 1 per person, 1 POI person, and 3 per team. So it is important. So what is the new rule that I've been kind of teasing within this video? So if you do not take a POI during your speech, the last 15 seconds, so the grace period of your speech, are dropped, which means that judges stop writing at 7. Clearly, we're also going to implement a fair caveat, which is, let's say you have just asked for a POI and no one gave you one, then it was a skill issue on the other bench's side. and the above rule does not apply. Again, the old rules also still apply. So at the moment that someone does not take PY, you can judges should also lower your speaker points and flip in close comparisons. So this is just a new rule that is on top of the rules that already exist. Okay, I hope that all of this has been clear. If you have any questions about either the motions or the rules or anything else, put them in the comments or put them in the Discord and we'll try to answer them. In the meantime, I'll see you this weekend and I hope you have fun. Bye.